This is video 1 of the Standard Library Fixed Objects module, and in this video we'll have an overview of the Standard Library. We'll talk about common property categories that are applicable across all Simio objects. We'll talk about entity arrival modes and stopping conditions as they pertain to the source object, and then we'll talk about state assignments that are done as part of the object processes. So if we switch to Simio here, you can see, as you recall, the libraries are shown over here on the left side of the default screen, and the standard library includes 15 objects. You can see 14 of them here, and recall that automatically the model entity object is placed in the project library. So including the model entity and the 14 shown here, we have 15 objects that are part of the standard library. And these objects from the standard library are used for general model building, and many models that you'll build will only use objects from the standard library. And some other models will also use subclassed objects, so I'm going to take an object from the standard library, subclass it, and then customize its behavior. We'll see that a little bit later on in the course. And so in this video we're going to talk primarily about the source object. But before we talk specifically about the source object, talk a little bit about something called common object categories. And as we've seen in previous videos, when we build Simio models, we take objects from the library and we modify the object properties to customize their behavior. And so you can see, as is shown here in this picture, that we have different property categories: process logic, buffer logic, reliability logic, and so on, that have the little plus sign here, means we can expand those. And these categories are common across multiple objects in the standard library. So all of the objects have process logic, many of the objects have buffer logic and reliability logic, and so on. So once you get used to working with the project categories, that knowledge is useful across the entire library. Another concept that's useful to understand, let me place a source object here, and we can see over on the right side the properties. And so here are the categories that we see, so entity arrival logic, stopping conditions, and so on. And when you place an object from the library, we can see in this case the entity arrival logic is open, right? So that property category is open, and so the reason it's open is because these are the property values that are commonly changed. So the designers of Simio pick those categories that are most used, and then whenever you place an object, an instance of that object, that category will be open. Secondly, if I go to source 1, and let me just change one of these. We'll talk about what these are here in just a second, but let me just change the maximum number of arrivals to 2. And we see that now the stopping conditions category is also open. And the 2 that I put here is bold. And so that tells me that I have changed this from the default value. And so if I, for example, close that category and then select a different object instance and then go back, that property category is now reopened. And so by default, Simio is going to open those categories that either have commonly changed properties or properties where we changed a value. And while we're talking about property values, changing a value, if you right click, there's an option to reset back to the default. So I reset that back to the default value and then switch to a different instance. And then when I go back to source 1, now the stopping condition category is closed because it no longer has a property value that's been changed from its default. And so that understanding the open and closed categories helps you determine which instances have changed properties and which properties are commonly used in model building. Okay, so on to the source object. Note that in this video I'm going to go through the basic properties and behavior of the source object, but we're not going to actually build it, use the source object in Simio. We're going to do that in the next video after we introduce the sync object, so we'll do a little bit of model building. So the source object is used to create dynamic entities. So dynamic entities enter at the source, they wait in the output buffer of the source object, and then transfer through the output node either onto the network or into free space. Some of the major properties include entity type, the arrival mode, the number of entities per arrival, the buffer logic associated with the output buffer so we can support blocking, stopping conditions for the source so that we can stop creating entities, and so on. And so we'll see an example of these here in just a little bit. Also recall from the module on animation that dynamic entities support multiple symbols. So you have a symbol list and you can change the symbol to change the look of the entity. And so the source object lets us specify multiple symbols, and they can either be assigned by number or randomized so that you can create different visualizations of the entities that are created through the source object. Also, as a tip that we will see a little bit later, if we use the source object with a data table, we can actually create multiple entity types using the same source object. Okay, so this notion of an arrival mode, the source object supports several different arrival modes. The first is an inner arrival time, where we have a random time, or typically random time, between arrivals. It doesn't have to be random, it can be deterministic. But basically you specify once an arrival occurs, what's the time until the next arrival. That's what the inner arrival time is. As we see here, we have an inner arrival time that's exponentially distributed with a mean of 0.25. This is the default inner arrival time if you place or the default arrival mode and inner arrival time if you place a source object instance. We can also have a time varying arrival rate, and this uses something called a rate table. So the example that we have here uses a rate table called customer arrivals. So if you think about customers arriving to a restaurant, for example, you would likely see higher arrival rates during lunchtime and during dinner time than you would either mid-morning or mid-afternoon. And so a rate table lets you specify those differing arrival rates. We can have an on event that we see here, and so in this case the arrival mode is on event, and the triggering event is input at sync 1 entered. So when an entity enters the input node of a sync 1 object instance, that triggers the source object to create an entity, and we'll see an example of this in the next video. And finally, we have an arrival table, in which case we specify specific arrivals in a table, and those tables include the arrival time, and that's what we have here, arrival time property. So table 1 arrival time column specifies the time of an arrival, and when that simulation time happens, an arrival is triggered. Note also that we have several different options for arrival table, which lets me deviate. So in other words, I can have an arrival time deviation and arrival no-show property. So for example, these two would be useful if you were modeling patients arriving to a doctor's office, for example, where you have a specific appointment time, but your actual arrival will either deviate around that time somewhat, or there is also some probability that you won't show up at all. And so that type of arrival process is supported through an arrival table. And so if we jump back to Simio for just a second, you can see I place my source object, and here's where the entity arrival logic is specified, where we have, as I mentioned, the arrival mode and then the various properties associated with that. The second thing we're going to talk about, the second category we're going to talk about, is the stopping conditions. And let me go back to PowerPoint. And the stopping conditions specify when the simulation should stop creating entities, and it lets you specify these several different ways. First of all, you can set a maximum number of arrivals. So in this case, I have shown the maximum number of arrivals is 25, which means after the 25th arrival, the source object will stop creating entities regardless of the simulation time or whatever other settings you have. In this case, I also have a maximum time of 8. And so this stops creating entities after 8 hours, again regardless of how many arrivals you've had, assuming in this case it's less than 25. So if you hit 25, it stops, or if you hit 8 hours, it stops. One of those two conditions, it will stop. We can also have a stopping event. In this case, we have a custom event, and when that event's triggered, then the source object will stop creating entities. So looking back again, there are several other categories of properties that we'll talk about later on in the course. But the last thing that we want to talk about in this video are state assignments. So if I open up state assignments here, you can see that we have before exiting, on balking, and on reneging. And so one thing I want to do before I go back to the PowerPoint is if I just click on one of these, and then I can look down here in the help, it specifies exactly when this happens. So the before exiting, this is going to be a state assignment occurs when an entity is ready to exit the object. On balking, if you have the balking logic set and the entity can't enter the network, then this assignment is made. And on reneging, the same thing. So if you have the balking option set for an entity to renege, when an entity reneges, it makes a state assignment. Okay, so again, what are state assignments? A state assignment lets me specify to assign a value to either an entity or a model state. And so you can see we have the ... and so that's indicative of bringing up a repeat group editor. So in this case, when I click on the three dots, it brings up the repeat group editor, and we have no state assignments so far. So if I click on add, then I can add the state assignment. And so in this case, I've made two state assignments. The first one I did was set the model entity dot priority, so the entity state called priority, to 12.5. And then a second one, I set the picture equal to picture plus 1. So I incremented the symbol index for this entity. And so note with state assignments, because of the repeat group editor, I can make as many state assignments as I want. And in fact, this type of assignment is common across all Simio objects in the standard library. They have different times when different simulation times when they're made, depending on what the object is, but the basic idea, the basic concept and methodology for applying those state assignments is common across all objects in the standard library. And so this is something that you use quite often. And so that concludes this first video from the module.